Hello, I'm Mark Mayer, the chair of the American Friends of the Hebrew University. I'm very excited to be here today with all of you at the Nexus Israel conference, and I'm honored to be with our two panelists today. Dr. Corey Bargmann, who heads the Lulu and Anthony Wong Laboratory of Neural Circuits Behavior at the Rockefeller Institute, where she is a professor, and is also the head of science for the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. And Malcolm Gladwell, a polymath author of 7 best-selling New York Times books, including Blink, Outliers, Tipping Point, and Talking to Strangers. This promises to be a fascinating conversation. So Dr. Bargmann and Mr. Gladwell, we are in a time of wonder and miracles, but also a time of terror. And these last few years have been, to use a word that is now no longer unprecedented, these have been unprecedented times. And so maybe you could share a little bit with us of what you have learned over the last couple years. Great thinkers are lifelong learners. So what have you learned that's really new and important? Dr. Bargmann?
Thank you for asking. So I would say that we started this philanthropy, the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, 5 years ago. And one of our stated goals was that we wanted to accelerate science, the pace at which science could move to make discoveries and breakthroughs. And in the past 2 years, we have learned that science really can move very fast, that things like vaccines, which had previously taken a decade to develop, could be ready in a year with the right tools, that many other discoveries could go from knowing what a new virus was to knowing its sequence, to knowing how it was spreading, to developing drugs to treat it very quickly. And I think that was a real shot in the arm for the idea that this could be applied to many other problems, not just this emergency. And the second thing I learned as we tried to develop ways of dealing in an acute way with this crisis was that everything proceeds through relationships, that the way to make progress is to involve many other people in your work. And our own work in the San Francisco Bay Area really was accelerated by the fact that we had relationships with patient advocates, with community groups, with hospitals, with technology groups, and with universities that let us work together to make progress fast.
Thank you. Mr. Gladwell.
Well, I would say that I've learned a lot about how adaptable we are as a society, far more than I would have imagined going into the pandemic. The number of discussions that I've had over the last 2 years with, for example, corporate leaders who have said versions of, I have made 10 years of changes in customer service in 2 years, or I have done 10 years of innovation in the last year and a half. I had a discussion with a guy who runs the supply chain consulting business for IBM, who said, the first thing he said when we were having our interview was, welcome to 2035. And I said, what do you mean by that? He said, well, we are now where I thought we would only get to until 2035. In other words, we did 15 years of progress in 2 years because the pandemic, in all those cases, forced us to examine what we were doing and make changes and overcame the inertia that I think had settled in many situations. So to me, that's the big good news out of the last 2 years, which, following up on the point made by Dr. Bargmann is that, we have the capacity to move and respond to crisis that has surprised, the pessimist in all of us.
Thank you. So you both offered very optimistic views that really reflect the resilience, the resourcefulness of our species, our ability to form relationships, to catalyze and accelerate change. Uh, the theme of our conference is to really explore important innovations that will build a more sustainable future for us. And this is a conversation that is all over. And while perhaps everybody doesn't believe that anything needs to be done, I think there's quite a strong consensus that a great deal needs to be done to build a more sustainable future for our species, for the species we live with around us, and for our planet. But there's a tremendous amount of disagreement, even among those who do feel a great deal of pressure for movement and change and progress. Can you maybe share with us from your perspectives, because you do think about this differently, where do you think the great needs are, and where do you think the leverage points are, the pressure points where change can occur effectively, rapidly, importantly, sort of using those strengths that you both so eloquently portrayed about what we have seen that's good during the last couple of years. Dr. Bargman?
So you're right that, part of my role as a scientist is to be an optimist, to believe that the end results of science are good. So I'm gonna hold to that position. And I'm gonna say that one of the things that I think can really make change is recognizing that science is not a luxury to belong to the few in the rich countries, that science is a necessity in low and middle income countries and in low resource settings within the wealthier countries, and that we need to share both the practice of science and the benefits of science very broadly to really make change. And within the work that we do, for example, we are very large supporters of what's called open science. We believe that new scientific information should not be locked away behind paywalls at journals or behind managed access in secret facilities. It should be shared broadly with as many people as possible to make progress. And we've seen that in open data sets we made during the COVID era, where, for example, we got together all the people who were doing very high order studies of what cells were susceptible to attack by the virus, and created an open resource where anyone could look up this information to try to learn how the virus might be spreading and how it was causing its complicated and mysterious effects, called the COVID Cell Atlas. We feel the same way about things like software, that there are many tools that can be made available worldwide that we just need to get out there and get people to use in a way that they can move their own agendas forward. And we see that also in very specific experimental areas like DNA sequencing. People often talk about how, since the Human Genome Project, the cost of DNA sequencing has dropped by a factor of 1 million. Well, that means that it's affordable to a lot of people now. And we really want people to be able to think about what's important in their own societies, what's important in their own issues, and to have that available to them as part of the next stage forward.
Thank you. Mr. Gladwell.
Yeah, I would say, I think every era discovers in times of crisis where the bottlenecks exist in its kind of society functioning. So if you look at in the era before coming out of the Second World War, what does the West discover? It discovers the bottleneck is a lack of educated people, right? That you have a whole series of cognitively complex tasks you want to do in that emerging modern economy. You don't have enough educated people to perform them. So what does virtually every Western country do in that era? They greatly expand educational opportunities. In the 50s, the bottleneck was trade. We were frustrating trade because, among other things, that, something as simple as the docks were these congested, inefficient, expensive places. And then what do? We invent containerized shipping, and we reinvent the modern economy in the 60s. In the 70s and 80s, it's government regulation. We realize a lot of badly conceived government regulation is throttling innovation and growth in the marketplace. So what have we discovered coming out of COVID is our bottleneck? I think we're discovering that we have badly misallocated public resources, that, I think, for example, it would be, following up on Dr. Bardman's point, a very rational response to COVID would be to double the budget of the National Institutes of Health in the United States. The returns to scientific funding are so large that you'd be an idiot not to throw a lot more money at the problem. We probably are massively underinvested in public health and overinvested in in specialized acute interventions. We kind of knew that going into COVID. COVID has underscored that. That just if you've got an underfunded and badly conceived public health apparatus, it could be the difference between 500,000 people dying in a pandemic and 1 million people dying in a pandemic. I could go on, but I sort of think, to my mind, that's the big lesson of this. Is it's told us what our bottleneck is, and it's suggested ways that we can resolve that bottleneck. So we're going through the same process that every era goes through coming out of crisis.
It's ironic that you talk about the modernization of ports in the 1950s, and yet here we hear that because our major port in Long Beach is so antiquated and so manual that is a major contributor to the inflation that everyone is experiencing.
Yeah, just imagine if they were
maybe knowledge and the overcoming of bottlenecks is somewhat cyclical, and we have to relearn some important lessons and solve problems over and over. So with that in mind, because again, I think you both have an optimistic view. How much time do we have? How much time do we have to address environmental disasters, which are, the cost of solution here is greater than anything we've ever thought of. It's not a question of doubling the national health budget. It's order of magnitude greater than anyone has ever contemplated. It's now years. It's not centuries. It's not decades. It's now years where if we don't really get things done, and how do we mobilize? How do we mobilize individuals, the private sector, academia, and the public forces to actually get things done? And where do you think we can break those choke points quickly and make a difference? Maybe Mr. Gladwell?
Oh, well. It's impossible to know how much time we have, obviously. If you think about on the question of, when is the next pandemic? Nobody knows. Could be 2 years, could be 10 years, could be 6 months. What is the exact timetable for global warming? We don't know. We know it's sooner rather than later. But again, we're in the dark about, and I think that being honest about the fact that you don't know what the timetable is the greatest spur to urgency. Those who can say with certainty we have 50 years to solve problem X are probably talking out of their hat. None of us know with any great deal of certainty. So that's why we should feel compelled to act. The other thing is, I don't think I think of it, the role of policy is not to adhere to some kind of timetable. The role of policy is to remove all of the obstacles to human ingenuity. Once you do that, human ingenuity will move a lot quicker than you imagine. But we erect all kinds of man-made obstacles to that path. And that's the issue. I think, we just need to pay attention to the ways in which we are frustrating the kind of thoughtful application of intelligence to our problems.
Thank you. Dr. Bardman?
So I would like to complement this sort of more policy-based perspective on how much time we have and what we should do by pointing out that for these really complex problems, we don't know the answers. And since we are here at the invitation of the Hebrew University, this is what universities should be doing. Universities should be engaged with the problems of society and trying deeply to understand what the truth is underlying them and what the paths forward can be, whether that's in politics, whether that's in science, whether that's in really grappling with the climate problems or the economic problems, to not be complacent, but to use their freedom and their ability to, in an unbiased way, in the best, none of us are truly unbiased, but in a broad way to try to understand what the problems are, to set up the first possible answers to questions, and then to help those spread.
So you mentioned the Hebrew University, our host here, and I wanted to sort of maybe use that as a springboard to a question. Perhaps because it is in Israel, Hebrew University has many of the characteristics of the other great large research universities in the world in terms of infrastructure and so forth. On the other hand, perhaps because it's in Israel, it has a certain underdog spirit, a scrappiness, a resourcefulness, a tilting at windmills, if you will, that has been very successful in capturing the linkage between basic research, basic learning, and ultimately application and in bringing it into the world in an entrepreneurial spirit. Right. So this is what we're all trying to understand. How can we get policymakers to spring from where you were, Mr. Gladwell, policymakers who are meant in your framing to clear the way for human ingenuity to solve problems? How can we get a partnership between policymakers and academic institutions to really sort of remove the barriers as opposed to build walls, build bridges instead of building walls to progress and to sustainability?
Yeah. Two examples, I think, of this. One is I remember years ago reading a really fascinating book that asked the question of why did Silicon Valley grow up in Northern California and not in Cambridge and Boston and Massachusetts? Similarly situated areas back in the 50s and 60s, very, very large established universities. In fact, a greater university kind of infrastructure in Cambridge than in Northern California. And yet the action happened on the West Coast, not the East Coast. And one of the answers was that the walls of Stanford University and Berkeley were porous, that knowledge flowed and people flowed easily out and into those institutions. So they were able to fertilize the intellectual landscape around them. The walls of MIT and Harvard were high and hard to overcome, and so the knowledge stayed inside. So lesson number one is that universities should have porous walls. And I don't know, I sort of feel like Hebrew University understands this as much as I remember once being on a plane. The guy sitting next to me was someone who taught, I believe it was Hebrew University. And I asked him about his life. He said, well, I spend a third of the year in Israel, a third of the year in Montreal, and a third of the year in Los Angeles. And I said, why are you spending 2/3 of the year outside of it? He says, well, I have a company in Montreal, and I have a company in Los Angeles, and I have a teaching position in Israel. And I thought, that's actually what you want. So there's there's an institution with porous walls, and there's someone who's seeding not one country with his ideas, but 3 countries with his ideas. Canada, United States, and Israel. And multiply that times, 1,000 curious, ambitious, energetic people, and you can begin to see how a university can spread its intellectual wealth widely.
So, Dr. Bargmann, you started out by saying that relationships and partnerships were so critical to the astonishing advances, right? Astonishing advances in sciences that we saw. So, but sort of taking that theme of porous walls, what can universities do, and how can we help them sort of reach through to society more powerfully and really catalyze some of the changes?
Well, just to follow up maybe a little bit on this notion of what the universities should be doing, they should be more open. And I think in science, one of the things that really strikes me about the universities in Israel, including Hebrew University, is also that they understand the importance of measurement and of precision and of really understanding what it is you are trying to get to in a directed way. what you cannot measure, you cannot control. And developing the kinds of strongly mathematical, quantitative, precise elements of science has been, has been one of the components that allowed places like Silicon Valley and science to interact so successfully together, because they were really working at the intersection of discovery and initial observations and of turning those into something concrete that could be moved forward. I would like to see more collaboration. I think that there are ways in which we can help the universities. A big part of my job is to fund scientists at universities now, and we fund scientists in 60 countries, including Israel. And I see in some of these places how their creativity and their ability to explore widely sometimes doesn't have what it needs to get to the next steps. It needs more support for platforms. It needs more support for instrumentation. It needs more support to scale up and kind of going from one initial promising observation to something that would be enough to start a company, that would be enough to get a pharmaceutical company or a tech company interested in your work. And I think one of the things that we can do in philanthropy, but also as governments, is to create that kind of bridging function. In drug development, this is called the valley of death, between where you start something and when you actually start to see the first stage of promise, where we can support the universities and their initial discoveries to reach the next stage of accomplishment.
So what can the private sector do? What can industry do? What can the capital markets and the financial system do beyond what it's doing today, right? I mean, obviously the profit initiative motivates investment in what is perceived to be great ideas that have commercial potential. But what more could be done, Mr. Gladwell?
Well, to follow up on something that Dr. Boardman was talking about, this notion of partnership. She was talking about what was it that allowed the private sector in, for example, Silicon Valley and academia to meet, or in Israel to connect those two different domains to cooperate usefully. I think that's the question that we need to take very seriously. So she was talking about this idea of having specific metrics that tell you what you're doing and allow others to evaluate what you're doing is a very useful thing. But I'm wondering whether we should go further. And I imagine there's 10 things that might be the most important, but there may be another 9 that also, this question of the movement of talent. Is it easy for someone who's in a university to leave the university and come back, to cross-pollinate with various other worlds? Do universities need to do a better job in thinking in an interdisciplinary fashion? I mean, we're starting to see that in some of the better institutions are setting up these interdisciplinary. But the next step beyond that is, should we be much more actively recruiting private sector partners to those kinds of interdisciplinary operations? The people don't like to talk about the role of military spending, but it's obviously very important right now. But for years in the United States, the Pentagon has played that role, right? It has funded research that has not a kind of not always with a clear outcome in mind, but they have supported a lot of applied research that has ended up spilling over into all kinds of different domains, and they've been quite generous in allowing it to spill over. And that's another, that idea of creating a kind of middle ground between, on the one hand, funding pure research, on the other hand, having a really, really clear thing in mind I like the middle ground. I like there to be some kind of movement around to allow for serendipity and creativity to run with an idea in an unexpected direction.
Dr. Bargmann, in your work at Chan Zuckerberg, and just thinking more broadly, what more can the private sector do?
So first of all, I'd like to recognize that the founders of the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative and a number of other people who've been very successful in the private sector have used philanthropy as a way of supporting the universities, and particularly science at the universities and technology, as a form of giving back. I think that's an excellent thing to happen, and it creates a little bit more energy and alternatives to the standard sorts of systems. I also think that we need to be thinking about the ways that these areas feed on each other and grow from each other. And again, I think that one of the things that the private sector has traditionally done is to take ideas and try to wall them off and keep them protected. And yet often much more happens when the ideas flow freely. There was a recent very exciting advance in artificial intelligence at a group called DeepMind, based out of Google, that developed a method for understanding the structures of biological molecules called AlphaFold. It's been tremendously exciting, and most importantly, they shared their results back freely with the entire academic community. Anyone can go back and build on that. And therefore, its impact will not just be on a small set of projects that Google DeepMind wants to do, but rather on what everyone studying these molecules will do. And I think thinking about that more broadly, and I think perhaps particularly for the tech sector to realize that academia is training their engineers and training their artificial intelligence scholars for the future, for them to be more involved in kind of giving back toward the institutions to create that virtuous cycle would be a desirable outcome.
Thank you. And I'd like to thank Dr. Bargmann and Mr. Gladwell for really optimistic and uplifting perspective on the capabilities of humankind and the promise that it brings for a more sustainable and better future. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Pleasure.